Buckle up, everybody, because today we are going deep inside the book of life, the human genome.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to be taking a deep dive into Matt Ridley's book, Genome, the autobiography of a species in 23 chapters.
Great book.
It is a fantastic book.
Yeah.
And it really is amazing how he uses this analogy of a book to explore this topic.
You know, it's a really clever way to make genetics accessible, I think, to, somebody who's not really familiar with the science.
Yeah, and he compares like chromosomes to chapters and genes to stories.
Right.
And even, paragraphs are the exons, the parts that actually like do something, and the introns are like the ads that interrupt them.
Yeah, the junk DNA, as it's called sometimes.
Exactly.
Although I don't think we can call it junk anymore because we're learning that it probably has a very important function.
Right.
It's just that we don't fully understand it yet.
Yeah, and the scale of information packed into our DNA is just mind-blowing.
Absolutely. When Ridley talks about scale, he means it. I mean, billions of words longer than like 800 Bibles. All crammed into the nucleus of a cell so tiny you can't even see it without a powerful microscope.
That's just amazing.
It really is.
So Ridley starts off by taking us back to the RNA world, a time before DNA was even a thing.
Like ancient Greece to DNA's Roman Empire.
I love that analogy.
Yeah, it's a good one.
So you might be surprised to learn that DNA wasn't always the big cheese.
Right. It turns out RNA, which we often think of as DNA's little helper,
Right.
was actually the main player in those early life forms.
Wow.
It could do it all, carry genetic information, and even perform cellular functions all on its own.
Amazing. So, what was life like back then?
Well, that's a question scientists are still trying to figure out, but there are some clues that point to RNA's priority.
Okay, so what kind of clues?
Well, for one, RNA can copy itself without any help from other molecules.
Oh, wow. So it's like self-replicating.
Exactly, and it's also involved in some pretty basic cellular functions that are essential for life.
Like what?
Like protein synthesis, building the proteins that do all the work in our cells.
Okay, so RNA was like the jack of all trades.
Pretty much.
So then how did DNA take over?
Well, that's a long story, but basically DNA is more stable than RNA.
Okay.
And it's better at storing large amounts of genetic information. So over time, DNA became the preferred molecule for storing the genetic code.
That makes sense. Survival of the fittest, right?
Exactly. DNA was just better suited for the job.
So Ridley then takes us on this really fascinating journey through our ancestry, but through the lens of genetics.
Right.
He talks about how even tiny changes in our DNA can reveal a lot about our evolutionary family tree.
Those tiny changes, the ones scientists call mutations. They act like signposts pointing us back in time, showing us how different species are related.
So what kind of relationships are we talking about?
Well, for example, you might know that chimpanzees are actually more closely related to humans than they are to gorillas.
Really?
Yeah. And we know this because of the similarities in our DNA.
That's amazing.
It is. And there's another interesting thing about human evolution.
What's that?
Remember how humans have that one fewer chromosome than other apes?
Yeah, that fused chromosome?
Exactly. Well, Ridley speculates that it might be a relic from a time when our ancestors were isolated, maybe on an island or something.
Okay.
And this small inbred population developed some unique traits.
Including the fused chromosome.
Right. And this isolation led to what's called a genetic bottleneck, a point where the population of our ancestors drastically shrank.
Oh, wow. So that means there was less genetic diversity.
Exactly, which shaped our genome, making it less diverse than chimpanzees.
But distinctly human.
Precisely.
Now, this isn't just ancient history, though, right?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
This genetic legacy has a huge impact on who we are today.
So, how?
Well, one of the most powerful examples Ridley gives is the story of the KE family.
Okay, who are they?
This family has an inherited speech disorder that's caused by a mutation in a single gene.
Wow, so one gene can affect something as complex as speech?
It's incredible, right?
Right.
Their difficulty with language shows us just how much our genes can influence our abilities.
And how intricately they're linked to even our most complex cognitive abilities.
Exactly. It makes you wonder how much of our behavior and personality is actually shaped by our genes.
Right. Have you ever struggled to learn a grammar rule?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Maybe blame your genes for that.
Could be.
So it's like we're pre-wired for language in a way.
It seems that way. It's
Yeah.
like our brains come with this basic blueprint for language, and then our experiences shape how we use it.
So fascinating.
It really is.
Now let's move on to a topic that's always generated a lot of discussion and debate. Sex and the genome.
Ah, yes, the battle of the sexes playing out in our DNA.
Exactly.
Ridley delves into the world of X and Y chromosomes, the ones that determine whether we're male or female.
Right.
And he explores this fascinating concept of sexually antagonistic genes.
Sexually antagonistic genes.
Yeah, these are genes that benefit one sex at the expense of the other.
So, like, how does that work?
Well, imagine a gene that makes males stronger or more aggressive. That gene might be beneficial for males in terms of competition and mating success,
Okay.
but it could be harmful to females if it makes them less likely to survive or reproduce.
So it's like this evolutionary arms race.
Exactly. Males and females are constantly evolving in response to each other, and their genes are caught in the middle.
That's so cool. I never thought about it that way.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area of research, and one of the best examples of this is William Rice's work with fruit flies.
Oh, yeah. What'd he do?
Well, he showed how male genes can actually manipulate female behavior through proteins in their seminal fluid.
Wow. So the males are literally controlling the females.
In a way, yes. It's like a form of chemical warfare.
That's crazy.
It's a reminder that evolution isn't always about cooperation.
Right.
Sometimes it's about individual genes promoting their own survival, even if it means manipulating the other sex.
Wow, nature is ruthless.
It can be.
Now let's get into a topic that's caused a lot of controversy over the years. The so-called gay gene.
Right. This is a really sensitive and complex issue.
Absolutely. Dean Hamer's research back in the 90s, linking a region on the X chromosome to male sexual orientation, really sparked a lot of debate.
Yeah, Hammer's research focused on a region called XQ28, and he found that gay men were more likely to share certain genetic markers in that region than straight men.
So does that mean there's a gay gene?
Well, it's not that simple.
Yeah.
First of all, sexual orientation is complex. It's not just about genes.
Right.
There's environment, upbringing, personal experiences, all sorts of factors that play a role.
Absolutely. We can't reduce it down to a single gene.
Exactly. And even if there is a genetic component to sexual orientation, it doesn't mean it's deterministic.
Right. Just because you have certain genes doesn't mean you're going to be gay or straight.
Exactly. It's more about predispositions and probabilities.
So it's like a recipe with many ingredients.
Exactly. And we're only just beginning to understand how they all interact.
This is a conversation that needs to be approached with a lot of nuance and understanding.
Definitely. The science in this area is still evolving, and it's important to remember that we need to consider the interplay of genes, environment, and individual experiences when discussing something as multifaceted as sexual orientation.
Absolutely. It's not a simple equation.
Not at all.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about intelligence and genes.
This is another fascinating topic that has captivated scientists and the public for a long time.
For sure.
And the research has consistently shown that IQ has a high heritability, meaning genes play a significant role.
So even if you're raised in a very different environment from someone else, your genes still have a strong influence on your intelligence.
That's right. And it's one of the things that makes this topic so controversial.
Because people worry about the implications for social equality and things like that.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that heritability doesn't mean destiny.
Right.
Just because a trait is heritable doesn't mean it's fixed or unchangeable.
Our environment and our choices still play a role.
Absolutely. And there's another fascinating aspect of intelligence that Ridley touches on.
What's that?
The connection between symmetry and IQ.
Symmetry.
Yeah, like facial symmetry or body symmetry. Studies have shown a link between higher levels of symmetry and higher IQ scores.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
So the more symmetrical you are, the smarter you are.
Well, it's not quite that simple, but there seems to be a correlation.
Okay, so what's the explanation?
Well, one theory is that symmetry is a sign of developmental stability,
Meaning what?
meaning that the person developed under optimal conditions.
So like good nutrition, low stress.
Exactly. And this developmental stability could lead to better cognitive development as well.
Wow, that's fascinating.
It is. And then there's another really interesting wrinkle in the intelligence story, the Flynn effect.
The Flynn effect.
Yeah, this is the steady rise in average IQ scores that's been observed over the past century.
Really? So people are getting smarter.
It seems so, and this points to the undeniable influence of environmental factors on intelligence.
Like what kind of factors?
Things like better nutrition, access to education, exposure to visual media.
So our environment can actually boost our IQ.
It seems so. It's like our genes provide the potential, but our environment helps us reach it.
That's amazing.
It is, and it highlights the complex interplay between nature and nurture.
Okay, so we've talked about genes influencing intelligence, but what about the environment influencing our genes?
Well, that's where the stress response and chromosome 10 come in.
Okay, tell me more.
Well, on this chromosome, there's a gene called CYP17, which is responsible for producing cortisol, our body's main stress hormone.
Right, cortisol, the fight or flight hormone.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that environmental stress can trigger a cascade of gene activity,
Meaning what?
meaning that stress can actually turn certain genes on or off, leading to changes in our bodies.
So stress can literally change our DNA.
Well, not exactly. It's not changing the sequence of our DNA, but it's changing how our genes are expressed.
Okay, so it's like flipping a switch on or off.
Exactly. And one of the things that cortisol does is suppress the immune system.
Oh, so that's why we get sick when we're stressed.
It could be a factor. When our immune system is suppressed, we're more vulnerable to infections and diseases.
That makes a lot of sense.
It also shows how interconnected our physical and mental well-being really are.
Right, our minds and bodies are constantly talking to each other.
Exactly. And our genes are caught in the middle, responding to both our internal and external environments.
It's amazing how much we're learning about the complex interactions between genes and environment.
It really is, and it's only going to get more complex as we learn more.
I can't wait to see what the future holds.
Me neither.
This is really fascinating stuff.
It is, and we're just getting started.
Okay, so what else does Ridley have in store for us?
Well, next up, we're going to delve into the world of jumping genes. Those bits of DNA that have a mind of their own.
Jumping genes? That sounds crazy.
It is. Trust me, you don't want to miss this.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Great, because this is where things get really wild.
I can't wait.
Let's do it.
Let's jump right in.
Okay, here we go. And it really challenges that view that genes are like this fixed blueprint, right?
Yeah.
You know, our behavior, the environment we live in it, can actually switch genes on or off. It's amazing.
So we're not just puppets of our DNA.
No, not at all. We have more control than we think.
That's empowering.
It really is. So speaking of genes being switched on and off, let's talk about chromosome 8 and these crazy things called jumping genes.
Jumping genes. What are those?
They're these little bits of DNA that can actually copy themselves and insert themselves all over the genome.
So they're like little nomads.
Exactly. They just jump around from place to place.
And what do?
Well, sometimes they can cause trouble. You know, they can disrupt other genes, leading to mutations.
Oh no, so they're like genetic troublemakers.
Kinda. Sometimes they're harmless, but other times they can cause diseases like hemophilia.
Wow, so one little jump can have a big impact.
Exactly. And Ridley uses this great example of the P element in fruit flies.
Okay, what's the P element?
It's a jumping gene that actually jumped from one species of fruit fly to another.
Really? So they can even cross species lines.
It seems so. It's like a genetic parasite.
That's crazy. So our genomes are way more dynamic than I ever imagined.
Absolutely. And that dynamism is also evident in those unique genetic fingerprints we all carry.
Oh yeah, DNA fingerprinting.
Exactly. Ridley explores this in Chapter 7, which focuses on chromosome 7.
So how does DNA fingerprinting work?
Well, it all comes down to these things called hypervariable mini-satellites.
Hypervariable what?
Mini-satellites. They're these short, repetitive sequences of DNA that vary a lot from person to person.
So like everyone has their own unique pattern.
It's like a genetic barcode.
And that's how they identify people.
Exactly. And it's had a huge impact on the justice system.
Oh yeah, like solving crimes.
Exactly. The story of the Narborough murders is a great example.
Tell me about it.
Well, a man was wrongly accused of murder, but DNA evidence cleared his name and led to the real culprit.
Wow. So it can literally save lives.
It can. It's a testament to the power of science to uncover the truth.
Absolutely. Speaking of uncovering the truth, let's talk about blood groups.
Oh, yeah. This is a classic example of how genetics can reveal our history.
So blood groups tell us more than just who we can donate blood to.
Exactly. They can also provide insights into human migration patterns.
Really? So it's like tracing our ancestors through blood.
In a way, yes. And it's pretty amazing what we've learned.
Like what?
Well, for example, did you know that people with blood group AB tend to have a higher resistance to cholera?
No way. So your blood type can protect you from disease.
It seems so. It's a great example of natural selection at work.
That's incredible. Okay, so we've explored our ancestry, our individual fingerprints, and now our blood. What else can our genes tell us?
We'll get ready for this because chromosome 12 takes us on a journey through the development of the human body.
Okay, this should be good.
And it all starts with these amazing things called Hox genes.
Hox genes.
What are those? They're like the master architects of our bodies.
Meaning what?
They dictate the body plan, telling cells where to go and what to become.
So they're like the instruction manual for building a human.
Exactly. And the amazing thing is that these Hox genes are incredibly similar across a wide range of species.
Really? So like a fly and a human have similar genes.
It's crazy, right? but it shows how nature has this basic blueprint for building bodies that's been tweaked and refined over millions of years.
That's mind-blowing. So
Yeah.
scientists can actually manipulate these Hox genes.
They can. They've done experiments where they knock out Hox genes in mice to see what
Then
happens.
what happens?
Well, it depends on which gene they knock out, but they can cause all sorts of developmental abnormalities,
Like what?
like missing limbs, extra limbs, body parts in the wrong place.
Wow, so these genes are really powerful.
They are. They control the basic architecture of our bodies.
That's incredible. Now, remember how we talked about language earlier?
Yeah.
Well, in chapter 13, Ridley takes us back to that theme.
Yeah.
But this time he's talking about the evolution of languages themselves.
Oh, wow. So like how languages have changed over time.
Exactly. And he explores how the similarities and differences between languages can actually mirror genetic patterns. So our languages are kind of like our genes.
In a way, yes. They both evolve and diverge over time.
And by studying these patterns, we can learn about human history and migration.
Exactly. For example, you can trace the spread of Indo-European languages and see how it correlates with certain genetic markers.
So our languages carry traces of our past.
They do. It's pretty fascinating.
It is. And speaking of fascinating connections, let's not forget about the lactase gene.
Ah, yes, the gene that allows us to digest milk.
Exactly. And it turns out that not everyone can digest milk as adults.
Right. The ability to digest lactose depends on whether the lactase gene stays switched on after infancy.
So some people lose that ability.
Exactly. And the interesting thing is that the lactase persistence mutation, the one that allows adults to drink milk, spread through populations that had a history of dairy farming.
Really? So culture can actually drive genetic changes.
It seems so. It's like a feedback loop. Cultural practices like dairy farming create a selective pressure that favors certain genetic traits.
And those traits become more common in the population.
Exactly. It's a great example of how genes and culture can interact and shape each other.
That's so cool. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but we're not done yet.
Nope, we've still got a lot more to explore.
Loquat.
Well, next up, we're going to dive into the world of aging and these things called telomeres.
Telomeres. What are those?
They're like the protective caps on the ends of our chromosomes.
Okay, and what do?
They prevent the DNA from fraying and becoming damaged during cell division. But the problem is every time a cell divides, a little bit of the telomere gets chopped off.
So it's like a countdown clock.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as our telomeres shorten, our cells start to age, and eventually they can't divide anymore.
So that's why we get old.
It's one of the key factors.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some fascinating exceptions to this rule.
Oh, like what?
Well, certain animals like bats and birds have incredibly long lifespans despite having high metabolisms.
So they're like the genetic superheroes of aging.
Kind of. They seem to defy the telomere clock, which raises some interesting questions about the relationship between metabolism, telomere length, and lifespan.
Wow. So maybe there's hope for us yet.
Maybe. We'll see what the future holds.
Okay, so we've talked about genes that protect us from disease genes that shape our bodies, genes that influence our behavior, and now genes that control our aging. What else is there?
We'll get ready for a mind-bending concept. Imprinted genes.
Imprinted genes. What are those?
These are genes that behave differently depending on whether they were inherited from the mother or the father.
Really? So it matters which parent you get the gene from?
It does, and it can have some pretty significant consequences.
Like what?
Well, Prader-Willi and Angelman syndromes are two distinct disorders that are caused by the same imprinted region on chromosome 15.
Wait, so the same gene can cause two different disorders?
It can, depending on which parent you inherit it from.
That's wild. So it's like the gene has a memory of where it came from.
It's kind of like that. And there's a theory to explain why this happens.
Okay, what's the theory?
It's called the genetic conflict hypothesis, and it suggests that there's an evolutionary conflict going on between maternal and paternal genes.
So like a battle of the sexes, but at the genetic level?
Exactly. And this conflict plays out in the womb, where maternal genes are trying to limit the growth of the fetus to protect the mother's health, while paternal genes are trying to maximize the growth of the fetus to ensure its survival.
So it's like a tug of war between mom and dad's genes.
Exactly. And this conflict can have some pretty interesting effects on the developing child.
Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, so we've explored the ancient world of RNA. We've traced our ancestry through our genes. We've delved into the mysteries of blood groups and Hox genes, and we've even pondered the meaning of free will.
And we're still not done.
There's more.
Oh yeah, buckle up, because next up we're going to tackle memory learning and a gene called APOE.
Okay, bring it on.
You got it. Yeah, and we've talked about all these incredible things our genes do, but Ridley takes us even further. He dives into the whole question of free will.
Yeah, I mean, if our genes shape so much about us, everything from how we look to how we act, then, like, how much control do we really have?
Right. Are we just puppets of our DNA? That's where chromosome 22 comes in.
Yeah.
Ridley really challenges that idea, that genes are destiny. He says it's not that simple.
So, like, what's the alternative?
Well, he points out that genes can be influenced by our environment and even by our behavior. It's not just a one-way street. It's this constant back and forth between nature and nurture.
So it's not genes versus environment. It's like they're partners.
Exactly. They work together to shape who we are.
I like that.
Hmm.
That makes me feel like I have more agency.
Me too. It means we're not just passive passengers on this genetic journey. We have the ability to influence our genes and ultimately shape our own destinies.
That's empowering.
And then Ridley throws in this other wild idea, circular causality.
Circular causality.
What's
Boy,
that? It's basically the idea that genes and behavior can influence each other, creating these feedback loops.
okay, I'm not sure I follow.
So, like, imagine a gene that makes someone more prone to anxiety.
Okay.
That anxiety might lead them to avoid social situations,
Right.
which in turn could reinforce the anxiety, making it even stronger.
So it's like a vicious cycle.
Exactly. And it makes the whole idea of a predetermined fate seem much less likely.
That's a relief. I mean, I don't want to think that my life is already mapped out for me.
Me neither. There's too much mystery and possibility in life for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, this deep dive has been incredible.
It has been, hasn't it?
We've explored so much from the RNA world to the intricacies of cell death and everything in between.
And Ridley ends his book with this really thought-provoking question.
What's that?
Who am I?
Wow, yeah. It's a question we all ask ourselves, I guess,
Yeah.
but it takes on a whole new meaning when we consider just how much our genes influence our lives.
It makes you realize that we're not just individuals. We're also products of this long evolutionary history. A story that's written in our DNA.
And understanding that story can give us a deeper appreciation for who we are and where we come from.
Exactly. It's not about being defined by our genes, but understanding how they interact with our experiences and choices to make us uniquely us.
Well said. This deep dive has just scratched the surface of this amazing story.
It really has. I encourage everyone to check out Matt Ridley's book, Genome, and delve even deeper into the mysteries of their own genetic blueprint.
Absolutely. It's a journey of self-discovery that can help you make more informed choices about your health, your life, and your future.
And remember, genes are not destiny. You have the power to write your own story.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Book of Life. We'll see you next time.